Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this fifth session of the reading group on Catherine Malabou's Destructive Plasticity. There are a couple of things having to do with the relationship between Baruch Spinoza and destructive plasticity that are worth reviewing further. One of these things with which I would start off this session would be the definition of form that Spinoza gives. And we have seen that form, of course, is the key notion in the whole plasticity issue. We have seen that starting from session one already, when we outlined Malabou's interpretation of Hegel in terms of plasticity. And form here is defined as the unity between body and soul. Form is the name that is given to the unity between body and soul, as per Spinoza. But in fact, this interpretation also overlaps completely with Malabou's use of form also in her interpretation of Hegel as a philosopher of plasticity. So yeah, this thing is needs already to be kept in mind, form, and this unity is more precisely and crucially located in the brain, in the sense that the brain is the place for this unity between body and soul to take place in Spinoza already. And why is that so? Essentially, this has to do with another Spinozian concept that we have already briefly touched upon in, I think, the last session or the one before, when we introduced Malabou's engagement with the neurosciences, and that being the conatus, namely, we may define briefly and cursorily conatus as the tendency of a body or of a body-brain compound to strive to self-preserve or to maintain a status of relative well-being, to keep a certain a certain basic homeostasis. And we have seen already that, and in the past few sessions, that Antonio Damasio has established direct parallel between this and some of the key findings of the neurosciences. Essentially, the way that our neural system self-maps, constantly maps the neural connections in turn connected to the rest of the body in a way that resemble the constant strive for homeostasis that conatus that Spinoza's conatus that Spinoza sketches already in his definition of conatus. So this tendency toward homeostasis that, of course, is perturbed over and over by external perturbation that then conatus processes over and over. And this system of constant effort towards self-preservation that is over and over denied and then reaffirmed is a formal matter. Is a formal matter in Spinoza already. First and foremost, because it occurs through progressive modulations, in the sense that there are two basic opposite poles, if one can put it like that, being joy and sorrow. Joy increasing the power of the subject to act and to be affected, and sorrow diminishing that power. And conatus essentially consists in a constant modulation between these two opposite poles, in a never-ending system of compensation between these two opposite poles, when the lacks of the one are made up for by the other and the other way around, over and over again. So it's a formal matter in terms of this constant modulation between these two opposite poles. And in this modulation, of course, emotions are in the foreground. For Spinoza, of course, reason and emotion cannot be separate, and in turn, subjectivity itself is heavily affected by emotion, first and foremost. Emotions have a key role, and emotions have a key role and cannot be separated from reason itself. And this modulation between joy and sorrow, between different degrees, different intensities of the power to act and to be affected, happen in the brain already for Spinoza in some kind of sketchy, intuitive way, and then in a more structured, scientific way a few centuries down the line when the neurosciences will be in full bloom. In this sense, too, conatus has to do with form. Conatus is what makes the unity between body and soul possible through this constant game of modulation between these two opposite poles. Spinoza already, as Malabou points out, describes this constant play also in terms of, how can I say, also in another strictly formal terms. Conatus has to do, as we have mentioned, with the with the constant strive for self-preservation on the part of organisms. Organisms are, of course, a system of interrelation between parts. An organism is constituted by parts organically interrelated with one another. And Spinoza distinguishes living organisms from non-living organisms in terms of harmony, rhythmic harmonies, one, if we may put it like that, between the various parts, in the sense that the living organisms are those in which the various parts display some kind of consistency in terms of rhythm, in terms of pacing, in terms of systematic quantity of motion in relation to one another. Whereas this harmony is not there in non-living bodies, in which the various parts follow rhythms and paces and quantities of motion on their own, that are not harmonically arranged with one another. However, and this is the key part that interests Malabou, Spinoza does admit of a third option, which is that in which the various parts of an organism follow different rhythmical pattern, follow different patterns in terms of quantity of motion. So these parts not displaying a reciprocal harmony with one another, while still their organism is not dead technically. So it's Spinoza does admit of a living organism in which the various parts are not in harmony and are not convergent, are not consistent in terms of the individual rhythms, individual paces that they display, in terms of the motion informing them. And Malabou maintains that this is one of the points of one of the moments of Malabou of Spinoza's philosophy, in which Spinoza kind of foresees what will be eventually theorized as destructive plasticity. This is destructive plasticity through and through, according to Malabou, namely a moment in which an organism still lives on, is not technically dead, but in which the various parts are not organically connected with one another in terms of rhythm, in terms of motion. So the balance between the parts breaks down, and what we have is some kind of death without death, or some kind of death without dying, so to speak. And this is what happens to the organisms, the human organisms that Malabou in several works of hers calls the new wounded, especially in the book of the same name, The New Wounded, namely organisms, human organisms that have undergone brain lesions such that the neural connections that define, by definition, personality are now radically different from the ones that were there before the break, before the lesion, that giving rise to an entirely new personality altogether. That is, to a personality that has no longer anything to do with the history of the subject that has undergone this kind of breeze lesion and that has been affected by this kind of destructive plasticity. The other major consequence for the subject when a subject undergoes this kind of destructive plasticity being the loss of emotion, which again is important in terms of which important in Spinozian terms, and in the terms that we have begun to sketch in the last few minutes, namely, whereas it is specifically emotion that informs most crucially conatus and the unity of body and soul that defines subjectivity. In the case of destructive plasticity, when this third option between and beyond the distinction itself between living organism and non-living organism happens, emotion is no longer there and is replaced by a radical indifference on the part of the subject that is affected. So all functions are there. The subject can speak and can exert minimally a reason and so on and so forth, but emotion is no longer there, and indifference, a radical indifference, has replaced it. In fact, even in this catchy formulation that Spinoza had already given of the phenomena, examples were already there, and he quoted one that Malabou then takes up, namely Góngora, the Spanish poet, which in the last year of his life lost his memory and entered this strange intermediate gray area between life and death, which destructive plasticity essentially is. Destructive plasticity is defined by Malabou, among others, as uh, subjects that have become the form of their own death. Now, again, the form of life, as in the form of the unity between body and soul, has to do with emotion, according to Spinoza already, through the conatus. And the form of a subject's own death, which destructive plasticity is informed first and foremost by indifference, by a radical indifference toward the subject itself, toward the other subjects, and toward everything that happens around. Um, then Malabou in the readings spent quite a few pages characterizing old age in this way as one of a key example of application of destructive plasticity. So of course Malabou is clear that not every account of old age is on the same page. There are of course differing accounts of what happens when a subject enters the old age. Malabou here is particularly interested in those accounts of old age that regard the old age as a twofold process, which on the one hand, of course, occurs thanks to a gradual change, namely the subject gradually gets old by the years, but then also undergoes at some point a kind of collapse, after which the subject becomes something different. A man becomes an old man, or a woman becomes an old woman, as a result of a sudden break that supplements the gradual getting old. And this is something that is observable empirically in a number of cases, which some of which Malabou brings up. It can be perhaps aptly summarized by a line that strangely Malabou does not mention, a very famous line that can be found in Fiesta by Ernest Hemingway. In Fiesta, there is this rich man, this formerly rich man that is now poor, and is asked by another character, how did you get poor from being so rich formerly? And he answers, first little by little, and then all of a sudden, or something like that. I mean, these were not the exact words, but what he says is something along the lines, first slowly, first gradually, little by little, and then all of a sudden, abruptly, all at once. And yeah, this has of course important consequences when it comes to a possible philosophy of time. Malabou spends a few pages on the writer that perhaps more than any other can be associated with a philosopher of time, namely Proust. And in some of the pages where characters get together after decades and finding again people that other characters had known previously, but with whom contact had been lost for a long time. Some characters come across as having undergone the gradual getting old of the old age, um, but other characters appear as another person would act these characters from the inside. So it appears like the different subjectivity, the subjectivity of a stranger would perform these characters, performs these characters as if they were somebody else. Um, that attesting to the fact that these old people described by Proust, by other characters, seem to have undergone a radical metamorphosis that have changed all of a sudden these people into something else. In other words, what is at play here in this example, and what is the philosophy of time that underlines this conception of the old age, is one in which continuity and discontinuity cannot be separated. And so, even in a quintessentially Bergsonian writer like Proust, there's more than a bit of Bachelard that turns up, namely a conception of time, at least in the pages that Malabou refers to, namely a conception of time in which discontinuity has the upper hand on the continuity that it ultimately ends up creating, ends up producing, or at least, or to the very least, continuity and discontinuity inhabit the same level, inhabit the same dimension, and cannot be separated from one another. Which is, of course, also the very standard, very traditional definition of subjectivity and of time by Hegel himself, by the way. So the literal definition of subjectivity is, in Hegel, this interplay between continuity and discontinuity. And even when it comes to clinic, which, as we've seen, is not the dimension that primarily interests Malabou, we have said that in a couple of sessions already. Malabou is not primarily interested in clinic, but is mostly interested in framing this phenomena so that this can be profited also by other dimensions, like not least clinic itself. But again, clinic is not the main aim, the main goal, the main target of Malabou's philosophy. Even from the point of view of clinic, Malabou attempts attempts at drawing an important consequence from all of this, namely that if we frame old age in this way, we might come up with a different or a new way of, for instance, taking care of all people. Namely, we might reposition or we might reconsider the importance when it comes to taking care of all people, of reestablishing contacts between the person that now the old person is and the person that it used to be. So if the old age is framed in this way, it might be the case that this reconnection is perhaps not that much important when it comes to taking care of them. So, but yeah, despite the occasional, very rare incursions into clinic that one can find also in the reading that was assigned for this session. Once again, clinic is not the main dimension that Malabou is interested in, and so it is perhaps better to look elsewhere for answers to the inevitable question, now that we have defined destructive plasticity, what to do with it? As in, what are the possible uses? What are the possible applications of this framework which Malabou attempts at defining, which is destructive plasticity? So one of these uses is has to do with ethics, in terms that and by ethics, I mean perhaps quite specifically a Levinasian ethics. Once again, as I have mentioned in passing a couple of times already, the past few sessions, Emmanuel Levinas is a rather important reference in Catherine Malabou's works. I haven't really delved a lot into this aspect, but this aspect should be taken into consideration. So, in terms of ethics, destructive plasticity is important according to Malabou because it enables us to recognize those people who have been affected by destructive plasticity, the so-called new wounded that have been transformed all of a sudden into a completely different person by this kind of brain lesions, as a kind of other which is also at the same time us. namely an other that involves us, an other that returns our gaze, another that we also are. And that is for at least a couple of reasons. Namely, one is because of the way our brain is set, we can always become like that in any moment for no reason at all. Or our brain can always get into this kind of accidents irreparably without those accidents being predictable. And so they are us is first and foremost for this reason, namely that we can become them anytime, in short, but they are us and we are them also for another reason, namely that they, as in the New Wounded, embody immediately, directly, that which grounds also our own normal subjectivity, our own regularly functioning subjectivity, namely the essence of subjectivity, being contingency. So their own state, that the blank slate that they have become, is a kind of direct, immediate embodiment of the contingent nature, of the contingent feature of subjectivity, that is the most essential feature of subjectivity, as Spinoza and Hegel had already intuited, but as neurosciences eventually had confirmed. And so yeah, at least for these couple of reasons, there is some kind of ethical importance attached to destructive plasticity. Then there's a set of strictly philosophical consequences of destructive plasticity, namely of the possibility to be transformed all of a sudden and for no reason at all in something that doesn't make sense in relation to what the subject that underwent this transformation used to be. And the key philosophical consequence of this possibility is the structural character, the structural status of the accident, of the accidental in the structure of subjectivity. Hence the title of Malabou's book that we are reviewing these weeks, namely The Ontology of the Accident. The key point is really the coincidence between accidents and essence. Accident being what is most essentially subjectivity, and hence needs an ontology, and an ontology of subjectivity needs the accident. The two things are inseparable, as much as the only feature, the only attribute that can be associated to necessity, again in a traditional philosophical sense, is contingency. The only real necessity for subjectivity is, for Malabou, the contingency of the accident that might always shape it or shape it anew. So again, the key point is really this clash, this coincidence, actually, this de facto coincidence between essence and accident, or necessity and contingency, which this neurological fact, this neurological structural possibility, which destructive plasticity stands for. Or, to put it as Malabou put it in one of the pages of the readings for this week, the structural possibility of an accident which changes a subject in that way, quote, must be acknowledged as a law that is simultaneously logical and biological, but a law that does not allow us to anticipate its instances. Here is a law that is surprised by its own instances, end quote. So once again, we have what in the past few sessions I have defined as the epigenetic character of any transcendental framework worthy of its name, according to Malabou, namely a framework that is only such a posteriori, or a law, as Malabou says, that anticipates the instances in a way different from the prediction of these instances. It predicts not only that instantiation of the law will take place, but it predicts also the unpredictability of how the instantiation of of this law can take place. So this possibility, the possibility of destructive plasticity informs subjectivity as a possibility that it is structurally unpredictable. And so even if it never happens, it is always there, latent as a possibility that defines the very essence of subjectivity. And again, as we have seen in the past few sessions, Malabou establishes a difference between this and, for instance, sexuality in Freud. What she approaches to Freud is essentially that with sexuality, we basically don't have surprises in terms of in the sense that whatever trauma a subject undergoes, it can always be related to it, and there can be no contingency that can surprise this primordial original framework as one that is not predicted in advance by this framework. These being essentially the main philosophical consequences that Malabou draws from destructive plasticity. But in the last few minutes of my initial overview before the Q&A, it's probably best to delve a little into an aspect that I have very quickly touched upon, I think in the third session or in the fourth session, but is, however, a rather important part of Malabou's elaborations on destructive plasticity, namely the consequences of destructive plasticity on a social slash political slash cultural plane. And again, here, what matters and what needs to be highlighted is the usual premise that we have seen ever since session 2 of this series of seminars, that the biological slash neurobiological dimension on one side and the, again, symbolic slash cultural slash social slash political and so on and so forth dimensions cannot be separated from her. Or more precisely, there is an empty intersection between the two, such that none of these two dimensions comes before the other and determines the other. There is always an ambiguity as to how these two dimensions are overlapped and, in fact, non-distinguishable. And why is this premise important in this case? This premise is important in this case because m- most times in which Malabou deals with what she calls the new wounded, so these people who are all of a sudden disenfranchised and disaffected and distanced, indifferent, um, and so on and so forth. So those people that have become emotionless and living deads of sorts, or people who have become the form of their own death, she points out several times that in a lot of cases, especially nowadays, it is impossible to establish whether um, they are like that because they are social outfits or the other way around. In the sense that, and this is something that we have seen when we dealt with in our seminar series, we have dealt with the difference between flexibility and plasticity, and more precisely with how plasticity relates to the contemporary obsession, particularly in the workplace, in the professional realm, in its emphasis on flexibility that informs so much of the contemporary world, especially in economic terms. So what she claims is that these people, among which there are, for instance, the permanently unemployed or the constantly precarious or the people who have lost interest in their faith and the chronically poor, and so on and so forth. So these kind of socially marginalized people enter a kind of gray area in which it is impossible to determine whether their social marginality has to do with the capability of their brain and body to adapt to this to the contemporary overemphasis on flexibility, or the other way around, or they have become like that because of these ordinates that inform the contemporary, especially professional, social, cultural, political landscape. And so she tends to see these people that have, again, people whose life has coincided with the trauma that has set them at the margins of society. So Malabou considers these people who have embodied their own trauma in that way, and they have become nothing but the trauma that have erased their possibility, as, let's say, a symptom of a basic flaw in contemporary society, and especially a symptom of contemporary society's overemphasis on flexibility. As we have seen when we have dealt with the difference between flexibility and plasticity, the difference between the two is that flexibility does not acknowledge the limits which instead plasticity revolves around. Flexibility considers itself of unlimited. Flexibility doesn't see the limits of flexibility. Whereas plasticity, by definition, is not only defined by the interplay between giving form and taking form, which also define flexibility, but also have a third and crucial component, which is the destruction of form. Failing to acknowledge the destruction of form as a key condition of possibility for the interplay between giving form and taking form, which of course informs the constant demand for adaptation, which uh, 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 which the contemporary emphasis on flexibility can be defined as. So by overlooking, by discarding, by failing to acknowledge the place of the destruction of form in the interplay between giving form and taking form, which defines flexibility, uh, flexibility and the flexibility and the emphasis on flexibility that we can see so easily around us in recent time actually produce the destruction of form, which in Malabou's terms also means literally the destruction of subjectivity. In other words, the emphasis of flexibility, with all its emphasis on inclusion as a goal that is universally desirable and attainable, produces exclusion. And the new wounded are the living embodiment, the living symptom of the truth informing, underlying the contemporary emphasis on flexibility, which is contrary to what flexibility thinks of itself, namely as inclusion, exclusion. So this new wounded as socially slash neurologically excluded from a society which asks adaptation, flexibility over and over, are the living symptom of what flexibility overlooks, which is the key importance of the destruction of form in the interplay between giving form and taking form. So they are the living symptom that there is something missing in the way that in the way that society thinks of itself as flexible and hence also as inclusive. They are the living embodiment of something that has been excluded from that pretension for inclusion. So, in front of the new wounded, Malabou says, and this is something that she says particularly in a book that she published in France, and which I don't think that has been translated in English, namely La Grande Exclusion, which sounds some like the Great Exclusion. In front of these armies of marginalized, socially marginalized people, whose exclusion has to do also with a lack of adaptability of their body-brain compound. In front of these people, Malabou says, the wrong answer is to try to integrate them in the current order of things, in the sense that it's not a matter of people being left out of a system into which they need to be integrated, but rather what is even more needed, according to her, is to um, take stock of this, take stock of what these new wounded embody directly on their skin by directly becoming their own trauma and by directly becoming the form of their own death. What should be done with that, according to Malabou, is a reconsideration of the premises of society themselves. Again, not necessarily in a revolutionary way or in a very radical way, but at least society needs to rethink of the flexibility that it prides itself of in terms of plasticity, which means it has to take into account the destruction of form that these people embody, and that has to become again a key component of the interplay between taking form and giving form, which otherwise defines flexibility as well as plasticity. In other words, the premises of society as flexible need to be revised in light of what these army of marginalized people reveal to society itself by displaying the symptom of what the flexibility so much praised by society has left out, is not aware of. And yeah, so it's again a matter of how to frame the main premises of society, as opposed to find some kind of clinical solution to its flaws. It's a matter of how exactly to frame these flaws. And yeah, so again, in short, it's a matter not of integrating these people back in society the way it is, but rather it's society itself that should reconsider itself, so that what it has left out and that has produced as a result these massive exclusion of people can be amended. With that, I would open up the floor to questions. While waiting for any questions to be formulated, perhaps a further element that can be mentioned is the emphasis that Malabou posits, at least in a couple of instances and a couple of essays, um, on the neurological phenomenon of the missing limbs, namely on the imaginary pain, like the pains that subjects feel in limbs, arms, legs, etc., that are not there. And so, by reviewing a number of neurological literature on the subject, again, the connection that she establishes between this neurological phenomenon and philosophy is that both disciplines agree in acknowledging some kind of primordial imaginative power to the brain in synthesizing an image of something, even when that something does not exist. So it's a kind of primordial power of imagination that is confirmed from the two angles of philosophy and neurobiology regarding and apropos these phenomena, these medical phenomena of pains or other feelings associated to limbs that are not attached to a body. So yeah, and this being essentially another instance, or yet another instance, of the destructive plasticity that has been sketched in the past couple of sessions. Any questions?
Yeah, I was just wondering, you mentioned that Catherine Malabou mentions the interplay between the biological and the symbolical, the neurological and the political. I was wondering, since I haven't read all of her books, not by a long shot, if when she talks about that, she mentions any work of art or any film to exemplify, or is it just a theoretical idea that she develops?
Not very many, but yeah, she does mention a few.
I think I recall her mentioning the Thomas Mann book, the Buddenbrook. Yeah.
Yes, and also at the beginning of Ontology of the Accident, in I think the readings for last week, the Almodovar complex or something like that.
Yeah.
Let me check it again.
And she also mentions Kafka.
Kafka, yes, definitely. The Metamorphosis, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, true. That too can be defined, and yes, it's a rather apt example because the social dimension of it is kind of lurking in the background, but never spelled out. Also in the also in the short story, but always there in some kind of virtual manner, even when it is not fully spelled out. So yes, definitely, Metamorphosis is a case in point. And as we will see in the readings for next week, another case in point is Duras and all that strand. And in fact, we will see an example next week of a recent instance of, not by Marguerite Duras, but by a strand that is recognizably Durassian, as one film by Ritipan that will be will be dealt with by you, I guess, Vasco.
Thanks.
So yeah, all the Duras strand is can be easily like is ripe with example of this interrelationship. And in fact, we mentioned Hiroshima Mon Amour last week, and Hiroshima Mon Amour is perhaps one of the key case in point when it comes to cinema of brain trauma or brain structures that are inseparable from a certain social and historical configuration. So yeah.
I was just watching a video. It was a lecture by the Ray Bradbury. He's a very famous author. He was speaking to some students, and he was saying that intuition has played a great role in his own way of writing, and he always begins to write without knowing where he's going to, and he gets all the time surprised by himself and by what his characters are doing and are thinking. And I just wanted to ask you your opinion. I mean, everybody. Could this justify as an incident, as a case of creative plasticity? Because it has to do with a very basic aspects of creativity, artistic creativity.
Yeah. So I would say yes, and I would also range informally among these examples, even things like surrealism before it, namely those instances in which a coincidence is postulated more or less implicitly between modernity and trauma as such, namely an assumption is made that a trauma has taken place, and hence something, whatever is produced from the blank slate that this trauma is produced, that this trauma has produced. And so, of course, this does not mean that Malabou necessarily frames modernity in this way, strictly speaking, but all of the instances, particularly in the 20th century, that have approached modernity in this kind of radical way can be taken as example of it, namely the acknowledgement that some kind of threshold has been crossed that cannot admit of a strong connection with what was before this threshold, and hence something has to unravel starting from the blank slate that this trauma has produced. So yeah, this is something that can be that the example that you have mentioned from Bradbury is an example of that, and indeed there is a relatively wide range of examples that can also be brought up in this regard. And again, the one that comes to my mind now is surrealism in this way and in this sense. So yeah, this is this can be ranged among the example of destructive plasticity once again, because, and it is important that I stress it further, it does not have to do strictly with brain lesions, in the sense that brain lesions are a key example of it, but the key assumption is always that of an indiscernibility between the neurobiological datum, between the neurobiological given and the corresponding social and cultural background. And so yes, one does not need necessarily brain lesions to produce destructive plasticity. Destructive plasticity can be a product of the background that of the wider social, cultural, and political, etc. background in which these brain lesions can be framed. Again, in a, I would say, still very traditionally Hegelian way, Malabou establishes a connection between why these brain lesions appear as an object of study only now, or in all recent times, and our recent times, in the sense that if these brain lesions are legible as such in our times, or in times preceding ours, not by a very long stretch, it is because the times themselves, in wider social, political, cultural terms, are conducive to study the brain in that way. So once again, that is a key, let's say, idealistic premise for the intelligibility of the functioning of the brain and the social conditions for this intelligibility to come to the fore. So yeah, definitely, thanks for this example. And yes, destructive plasticity is not necessarily strictly depending on brain lesions, but what they depend on is a trauma that can be as social as strictly neurological.
We mentioned Alain René last week, but another filmmaker that I've been thinking a lot about while we were talking, it is Laze. Especially there's the accident and there's the go between, but there is Mr. Klein. Maybe also it goes a little bit with Pano's question. There is a difference of perception of who Klein is, and then maybe he becomes something that actually he wasn't. And it's very interesting because he's always looking at the mirror and confronting his image in the mirror. Deleuze and Guattari, they talk about Mr. Klein with an Arthur Miller's book that is Focus. And there's a scene in Focus book that the character puts some glasses and then he looks at his nose and he says, oh, maybe I am Jewish. And then suddenly, oh, the becoming a minority appears. And there is a relation there with the plasticity that Malabou is talking about, more than the flexibility of Freud. But then it
Definitely, because again, Lucy has worked substantially on the death drive in lots of different ways. Lucy is one of the key directors when it comes to masochism in cinema, in very much the terms that Deleuze set in his The Cold and the Cruel. Things like The Servant, for instance. So yeah, yes, definitely Lucy is to be ranked among those who have worked most convincingly with the radicalization of the death drive in cinema, in ways that, yes, in a lot of places do resemble very closely destructive plasticity. One title that I would add that perhaps exemplifies destructive plasticity even more radically is The Trout, a late film with Isabelle Huppert from 1982, I think. Is some kind of unspoken follow-up of Eve. And yeah, and it's set in Japan, so that too echoes various concerns that we have touched upon in the past few sessions, especially related to the atom bomb and so on and so forth. So yeah, definitely the films that we have mentioned, to which I would add The Trout as key examples of this key cinematic examples of destructive plasticity in this way. Joanna, in the messages this weekend, I read one called Clitoris and Thorn, and it talks about Lars von Trier's Nymphomaniac. Yeah, there is a chapter of the book that Malabou dedicated on the clitoris that indeed analyzes Nymphomaniac. Is something that I was going to mention in session 2, but when I dealt with Malabou and feminism, but eventually I didn't for reasons of time. So yeah, possibly, if I remember correctly, in that film it was more a matter of the status, perhaps the status of difference and identity more than. But no, destructive plasticity actually was also very relevant in that analysis. So yes, definitely this should be added to the list of references. Thank you, Joanna.
My idea is like Malabou here is trying to add, being a Hegelian herself, or her thesis, no? It's like trying to add negation and contingency into a world of science and neuroscience. So I think that is her like project in adding like this like limit to flexibility. Somehow adding like this I would say philosophical negation into the discourse of science. Yeah, it's a comment.
Yeah,
And what
no,
you said.
definitely,
And
definitely.
also,
Yes.
one more thing, and I wonder, but then maybe this is yet another universe, which differentiates her from Deleuze, which is more like Spinozist and a yes saying, let's say that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, she too tries to, let's say, revise the way Hegel talks about negation, in the sense that, yeah, it definitely is about negation. She isn't too fond of the term negation itself. I mean, she perhaps she does agree with Deleuze that the conception of negation has problems. But yeah, it is the unspoken assumption of destructive plasticity, as you're suggesting, or to put it like, yeah, and it's again about opposing any suspicion of determinist positivism. So in other words, it's a matter of like acknowledging that there's a void at the core of the machine. Flexibility is a machine, namely some kind of, and that's why she doesn't like the term negation, because it too readily enters some kind of speculating identity with affirmation. And indeed, one of her books called The Plasticity at the Basque of Writing deals with the two parallel negativities with which she replaces Hegel's negative. So yeah, flexibility, which means the narrow way of intending plasticity as having to do merely with giving form and take form, enters some kind of machinic identity with one another, into which, at the core of which, there is a void that must be acknowledged, which is a kind of negativity, which must be acknowledged, which is the destruction of forms, which is what plasticity adds to flexibility. So yes, definitely. Her challenge is that of completely endorse and fully follow the way of neurobiology, while at the same time acknowledging that neurobiology needs philosophy in order to not misunderstand itself as a tool for the maximization of the flexibility, which is something that would have nothing strictly scientific about it, but it would be an unacknowledged product of a certain ideology, which is contemporary ideology of, of flexibility no matter what. So it's perhaps, so the idea is that neurobiology does not so much need philosophy in order to enter some kind of third term that will be the synthesis of the two. But what she actually maintains is that neurobiology needs philosophy to be neurobiology. And in order not to fall into the mistakes that would make it, as in, again, neurobiology, a mere byproduct of the overall ideological arrangement of society. So yeah. So that would be more.
Thank you. So well said.
You're welcome. Thank you. Nicholas?
Hello. I had a simple question regarding the jump from the individual to the social. I didn't find it in the text, or I didn't. I wasn't really convinced anyway, and maybe I want to know, where does she speak about it more, or maybe how you could explain it. If I understand, there's a kind of Spinoza's model for the individual. When it jumps to the social effects or the political imperatives of flexibility, I wonder if the Spinoza's metaphor or the Spinoza's model still functions. So, are we talking about just the social body as is? Yeah, I'm trying to think this out.
Yes, thank you.
And also, just another thing.
Yeah.
For the individual, if we're talking about the effects of destructive plasticity as being indifference, I I wonder if this also applies to the social body. Is the effect indifference? Depression maybe among people who are unemployed, but yeah.
Thank you. So, yes, indeed, that was not in the reading for this week because it was part of the reading for week 3, which I couldn't cover that session because of time reasons. And more precisely, it's from What Should We Do with Our Brain, 2004, which is a book in which she deals far less with Spinoza, actually. But yeah, so that is one answer. The other answer, or one of the answers to the other questions, is that indifference at a social level. I think here she agrees with like it's not always the case, but here Malabou agrees with the account of Malabou that Slavoj Žižek gave. In one of the books in which Žižek talks about Malabou, she defines the new wounded as the new proletarians, essentially, in a fairly straightforward Marxian sense. And yeah, so Malabou agrees with that, I think, in ontology of the in the early part of ontology of the accident. And indeed, for her, indifference at a social level, at a mass level, is what characterizes the new proletarians. There tends to be she tends to establish a parallel between the new wounded and their indifference and the most recent iteration of what in different centuries could be called the proletariat. Now, with this, I'm not sure I have answered all of your questions. Perhaps there was one or two that I have skipped.
No, that was it. It was, but is the parallel, which I'm unsure about. But you've explained where it came from, and yeah, it's helpful.
When she does that, to be fair, she kind of well, not necessarily abandons Spinoza, but she doesn't really refer specifically to Spinoza on that. The Spinoza part is something that she takes primarily from Antonio Damasio. So most of the times that she talks about Spinoza is in a kind of prolongation of the ways in which Damasio engages with Spinoza. So yeah, when let's say the morphing between the individual and the social is not something that she approaches by recurring to Spinoza, in other words. So yeah.
I wanted to I come to this from art, so it's a little less philosophical, but I've always been fascinated by Malabou's by the annihilation, the concept of annihilation, and felt that there was a lot of potential in that for societal change. In the specific sense of destructive plasticity, I'm not sure if that ties to annihilation, and maybe it makes sense, and destructive plasticity makes sense in the treatment of groups or changing of society, as you mentioned earlier. But I wondered if you could kind of talk to annihilation in context of what we've been talking about today.
Annihilation, you mean in artistic terms? No.
No, not necessarily in her thoughts.
Yeah, the basis of it all is annihilation as the condition of subjectivity, the condition for subjectivity to actually work regularly. And it is a condition of possibility that is not absent. It's not relegated to some kind of transcendental inattainability outside of the frame, but it's very much within the frame. It's part and parcel. It's embedded in the interplay between giving form and taking form, which defines plasticity. And again, and annihilation in subjectivity is a key component in terms of a possibility that is always that is always there, not necessarily actualized, but the fact that the possibility of annihilation or total transformation for totally contingent reasons that have nothing to do with the history of the subject, being always there, and by always, and what should be meant by always is in essential terms. So it is essential for the subject, it is an essential condition of possibility for the subject that this possibility is there throughout. The existence of this possibility on and throughout is an essential feature of subjectivity. And by annihilation is very literally meant something which clears the slate in such a way that there is no longer any connection with what was there before. This is something that I already mentioned, but it is worth repeating further because it really is one of the key things to be taken into account here.
Annihilation is not the same as destruction.
Well, in the same way that, yeah, I mean, I read this lack of coincidence between annihilation and destruction in the same way as the death without dying, which destructive plasticity is.
Yeah.
And in this sense, yes, annihilation is not destruction. With destructive plasticity, subjectivity is not cancelled. It's just rewritten into something that has nothing to do with what was before. But it's not that it disappears. It's there, but it becomes something completely different.
Okay. But for me, the idea of annihilation has some of us feel I feel particularly a useful subject to within the context of the current world situation. The idea of annihilation seems very attractive. Not in terms of annihilating people, but in terms of annihilating things that we do that are not useful to people. And so I've often read Malabou in that sense. It's always giving me a sense of possibility, even though.
Yeah, here, perhaps one thing that might be worth reiterating is a substantial difference between this destructive plasticity and some kind of radical incompatibility between destructive plasticity and something like a Schumpeter creative destruction. What destructive plasticity is not is a kind of destruction that lays the foundation for other creation to be like what it is not is a kind of destruction that is made for other creation to come in its wake. Destructive plasticity is immediately creation. It's immediately a destruction that immediately it's a destruction of a form that immediately coincides with another form, not the establishing of conditions for other creation to happen on it, as it were.
Okay.
Thank you again to everybody, and see you next session in 2 weeks' time for the final session of this seminar series.